I'm Lara Land, somatic coach and yoga teacher trainer, and this is the Beyond Trauma podcast. What a couple of years we have had. The challenges continue to grow, and more of us are experiencing some level of traumatic stress. My commitment here is to bring you the most up-to-date insights on exactly how trauma affects our mind, body, spirit system, and how we can work with our bodies to soften its impacts. You will be hearing from trauma survivors and researchers, and together, we are going to incorporate what they have to teach us to heal ourselves and promote the well-being of all those around us. Here we go. It's out! The Essential Guide to Trauma-Sensitive Yoga is now available everywhere books are sold. This is the book for every yoga teacher, studio, and practitioner who wants to incorporate an inclusive practice to yoga. It's available on my website, laraland.us, and everywhere books are sold. If you're loving this podcast, you are going to love this book. Well, I know you're going to go crazy for this one because we know from Netflix and Hulu and I guess every platform out there that folks are interested in cults. I don't know why. Maybe we wonder how folks can get into that situation. Would we get into that situation? How would we get out? Maybe we question if some of the organizations that we're a part of, some of the groups we're a part of, some of the religions we're a part of are cults. Maybe we have that question inside of us. So I think there's a lot of reasons we're drawn into this. And today we are going to answer quite a lot of your questions. I have on today Dr. Steve Eichel, who received his BA from Columbia University and his MS and PhD degrees from UPenn. He's been a licensed psychologist since 1982. And he is a expert in cults, in folks that get into cults and how they get out of them. He's even developed some of the terminology around cult actions, particularly cult hopping, which we talk about in this episode. We cover a lot here. We cover some specific cults, the connection between politics and psychology, coercion, dictatorship, brainwashing, what kind of signs that you might be in a cult, how to get out of it, who's a target, the 2 tests for if you're in a cultist situation, the 2 kinds of people who are not vulnerable to cults. And we leave on a positive note for the future. There's quite a lot in here. And wow, I know I'm going to be listening to this one again and again because there's a lot of great references here and a lot of papers and other practitioners, philosophers and psychologists and doctors that I will be looking up. So take a listen and let me know what you think. There we go. So thank you so much, Dr. Steve Eichel. Did I say it right? The German pronunciation?
That's closer than most people.
Okay.
That deep guttural, Eichel. Actually means acorn.
Acorn. Oh, I love that. And I probably should have known that. As I told you, I married a German.
Well, your husband will know it, and he'll also know the second definition.
Okay. Oh, yeah.
Which is a bit more private and much funnier.
You Germans.
Yeah, part of the male anatomy that looks like an acorn.
I think I can guess.
Yeah.
And he's going to say right now that I've told you this so many times. Gets harder as you're older to learn language, or that's what I'm telling myself.
Yes, it does.
So I wanted to bring you on today because of this specialty you have, this podcast, we talk about different types of trauma. I've had a lot of survivors on here, and then we also discuss different modalities for healing the impacts of trauma. And well, first of all, we haven't done that much talking about psychotherapy here. I'm getting more into discussions about different therapeutic models, and I think that will be an interesting part of our conversation. But also around cults. I know you have a specialty in helping folks who have left cults or to come out of cults. Maybe you can start us off just with a little background on how did you get into psychotherapy and how did you get this specific interest?
Well, that could almost take the hour in and of itself. I'll do my best to be brief. So, how I got into cults, I'll start with that because that actually predates my interest in psychology. Part of it has to do with my background. My background is that I am the child of Holocaust survivors. So, both my parents grew up in Nazi Germany. My one surviving grandfather had been at the time a leader, sort of like the equivalent of a ward leader before Hitler took office. He was sort of the ward leader of his local area in Oldenburg, Germany, for the Social Democratic Party, which at that time in Germany was the only party that was trying to hold up the Weimar Republic. It was the only truly democratic party. It was the Social Democrats in the 1930s in Germany were being beaten up from the left by the Communist Party and beaten up from the right by the Nazis. So, and the first people to be put in the camps were the Social Democrats, not the Jews. So anyway, I grew up with a very strong connection with my grandfather, and that also involved a strong kind of political connection. To this day, I still consider myself a social democrat, and I follow the Social Democratic Party in Germany and elsewhere in Europe. So I grew up with a gut level, and that's the best way I can put it. It's a gut level distaste for coercion and for dictatorship. It is in the mitochondria of my cells. So, right from the get-go, I just had this gut level hatred of anything that smacks of political or religious or any form, really, emotional of coercion. So I became interested, not so much in cults, but I became interested in extremism, I guess, when I began talking and I began getting somewhat politically involved and interested. This was during the late 60s and early 1970s. And, it was a lot like today, frankly. There's a lot of polarization, and there are a lot of people who are extreme on the left, a lot of people extreme on the right. And I really had difficulty. I noticed that when trying to get into political discussions with them, it was like talking to a brick wall. And at the time, I was a political science major. So I was very interested in political theory and in politics in general. And the people on the extremes, it seemed like we were talking a different language. So anyway, there are some things that happened in my personal life that is actually a subject of an article that I'm writing for a journal that'll come out sometime probably in the summer. So I'm not going to get into the personal stuff that was going on. But to make a long story short, I wound up after my freshman year of college. I indulged a little bit. I indulged too much in specifically LSD, and I wound up at one point hospitalizing myself overnight. That was the last time I ever did LSD, and I was on academic probation for a year at college as a result of that. And I was invited, you might say, let's say I was invited to go to therapy, or the invitation to go to college would be rescinded. So,
Ah.
so,
Lots of choice based.
Viktor Frankl would say, I had a choice. You always have a choice, but I chose to stay in college, and therefore I had to go to therapy. So that was my first experience with therapy, and it was really it was just eye opening. It was the first time I ever experienced. I fortunately wound up with a good psychologist, and it's the first time I ever experienced somebody really listening to me on that kind of a deep level. It was amazing. So I had a very positive experience that summer in therapy, and I went back to college. I was still a political science major. I remained a political science major until the second half of my junior year in college. That's when I finally switched to psychology. That decision was made largely not so much on a personal basis, but more on kind of an intellectual basis, I guess. I was at Columbia University, and the political science department there at that time, and probably now, was so big that you had to decide on a concentration within the department. So my concentration was political theory, and I had a phenomenally good political theory professor, Doug Hodgson, who was I later on learned that he was, from a philosophical point of view, kind of on the libertarian side. And he was very challenging. And one of the things I learned was that when you get right down to it with politics, it really boils down to what you think human nature is all about.
Mm.
And at some point, I decided, human nature is really the study of psychology, not the study of political science. So I'd already taken psychology courses, so it wasn't like I was going in there blind. I had my intro psych classes and everything. So I wound up switching to psychology at that point because of my own personal experience, having been with a good psychotherapist. I was really, interested in becoming a psychotherapist, and I always wanted to help people. So, that's what I wanted to do. So I eventually got into graduate school, and then, eventually got my PhD in psychology. But what happened was in the spring of it had to have been before the spring of 75, it must have been the fall of 74. I approached my favorite psychology professor, and in fact, my favorite professor of all time in any subject. His name was and is Phil Shaver. I approached Phil Shaver with the idea of doing an independent research in social psychology that would involve, and I'm going to try to be very brief here, it involved allowing myself to be recruited into a cult. And then I had a structured interview process that I was going to engage in with various members in that cult. So I was going to, basically do some research on people in that cultic group. And that cult was the Unification Church, otherwise known as the Moonies. So I allowed myself to get recruited into the Moonies. Well, first of all, Phil Shaver, approved the independent study, approved my questionnaire and all that. And I allowed myself to get recruited into the Moonies, which ultimately led to me spending 1 week in Barrytown, which is their Eastern seminary. And that was where I first experienced what I would now call, and even back then, what I called sort of a kind of brainwashing experience. What had happened was just before I went to Barrytown, well, there are a couple of things that are interesting. First of all, when I told my father about this, he made me sign a document that basically gave him permission to get me, whether I wanted to leave or not,
Wow.
to get me after a
Yeah.
week. Because my father, having survived the Nazis, was very familiar with this kind of group. And he didn't forbid me to go, but he did say, I want some protection. So I signed a paper saying that if I'm not back after the 1 week, because this is a 1 week course, if I'm not back after the week, it's because I'm being held against my will. So I went off to Barrytown, and actually, just before I went off to Barrytown, my college roommate, with whom I'm still quite friendly, my college roommate at that time, Ken Brightfield, he had just taken social psychology, and he wrote his term paper on brainwashing. He wrote his term paper on coercive persuasion. And I read that paper. I literally read that paper on the train to Barrytown, which is
Hmm.
located upstate New York off of the Hudson, not far from Tarrytown, New York. Barrytown is not a town. Barrytown was the home of I believe, a Catholic monastery of some sort, and the Moonies bought it, and it became their Eastern training seminary. Anyway, I I read this paper that Ken wrote about coercive persuasion or brainwashing. I literally read it while on the train up to Barrytown. And then when I got to Barrytown, after about 2 days, well, first of all, I'd gotten approval from the Moonies to do this study. I mean, I went to them, I said, I want to interview people. Here's the protocol I'm using. I gave them a copy of it, and they gave me permission. They said, no problem, come up to Barrytown. You can do this. No problem. Well, I got up to Barrytown. The first thing they did was confiscate all my questionnaires.
Yeah.
Right. So they completely lied to me about that. So now I was stuck because I was supposed to do these structured interviews and I don't have my questionnaires with me, and I'm there for a week. So, so anyway, I underwent their training. After about 2 days, it occurred to me that what they were doing was right out of the paper that I read by Ken.
Yeah.
So it hit all the things. I mean, Ken had primarily looked at Edgar Schein, who was the guy who coined the term brainwashing. He looked at Edgar Schein's work. He looked at Robert J. Lifton's work, and he summarized all that. And here I am in Barrytown at the Moonies Training Center, and it's like, oh my God, they're ticking off all these points, all the points that were brought out by Edgar Schein and by Robert J. Lifton, they're doing it.
Can
So,
you share some of those with us? Like what we,
yeah,
yeah.
sure. All right. So first of all, the Moonies put you on a buddy system, and the buddy system was you were with somebody who was a Moonie, but they didn't necessarily tell you that. They all pretended. My workshop, let's say, I don't remember, maybe there were about 20 people in it, and it was through CARP, the Collegiate Association for Research of Principle, which is a Moonie front group, just like the Citizens Council on Human Rights is a front group for Scientology. So anyway, this was a CARP workshop, and there were about maybe 20, 25 people in it. I would say maybe 5 of us were new. The rest of the people in that workshop were people pretending to be new, but they were
Oh,
already Goonies. Okay. So they had a buddy system. The buddy system meant that you had to stick with your buddy. You were assigned a buddy. And the buddy, of course, was a Moonie. And he followed you everywhere. I'm talking about when I went to take a pee he went to the urinal next to mine.
you're always being observed.
Always being observed. The food was not great. It was very low on it was very heavy on carbs, very low on protein. You got maybe 4 or 5 hours of sleep. They would come into the men and women, of course, were separated, and the men's barracks or whatever. We had bunk beds in this dormitory style setting, and they would come in and start at 6 a.m. and just start with a guitar and just start blasting music at you to get you up. So all your time was scheduled. Everything. There was no time to question anything. There was no time to discuss anything. It was just one thing after another. Your food intake, like I said, was limited. Your sleep was limited. The people you could talk to were limited. A constant repetition of the same things over and over and over again. Those were just some of the tactics that I noticed were going on at Barrytown that were very, very similar to what Robert J. Lifton described when he was talking about the concentration camps and the re-education camps in Mao's Red China, as well as in North Korea during the Korean War. Just the overall milieu, the tactics, they were very, very similar. I snuck out at one point at night, wandered around a little bit, and I heard a recorder going, saying things in Korean, and then people shouting it back in Korean. So this was like 2, 3 in the morning. There was some kind of, repetition thing going on and I think most of it was in Korean. Some of it was in English. So those were just a few of the sort of the highlights of how of what they were doing. I could get into it a little bit deeper in terms of what happens later on, but it's really, and of course they engaged in what, everyone at this point has heard the term love bombing, right?
Yeah, yeah, but
Okay.
you can explain it a little.
Well, I'm going to do more than that. I'm going to tell you where the term comes from. All right. Most people don't know. I mean, it's like gaslighting is being thrown around sometimes, well, a lot of times probably inaccurately, but 10 years ago, nobody even knew the term gaslighting, right?
Yeah.
So now, people talk about it left and right. The same thing was true in the 1970s. The term love bombing didn't exist. We all know it now. Well, that's because the Moonies basically invented that term. And what we would do is we would line up to play bombardment. Do you remember? Did you ever play bombardment in school?
No, I don't know that one.
Okay, well, bombardment is where you get a bunch of people, right? A bunch of kids, let's say 30 kids, and you divide them into 2 teams, and they're on the opposite sides of the gym, and you get a volleyball. And what you have to do is you have to run up to a line and throw the volleyball and hit someone on the other team. If they catch it, you're out. If you hit them and they don't catch it, they're out. And of course, the last team with people still, playing is the winner. Okay, so you're following that, right?
Yeah, yep.
Okay, so you run up and you throw the ball really hard, because you don't want the person to catch it. Well, the Moonies would do that and they would shout, "Bomb with love, bomb with love, bomb with love," and that's where the term love bombing came from.
Wow.
But of course, what love bombing really is it's a manipulative technique in which, and the Moonies use this a lot, not nearly as much as other cultic groups, especially the what's now known as the Family, but back then it was the Children of God. They did love bombing to the extreme, but love bombing usually involves getting your more attractive male or more attractive female members to pay lots and lots of attention to a recruit. So you're literally love bombing them.
Yeah, I've heard it used in like domestic abuse
Sure.
situations.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
That's what abusers do after they put you in the hospital. They love bomb you.
yeah.
That's exactly right. But the term actually comes from the Moonies. That's where it
Wow.
came from originally, back in the early 70s. So, yeah, that experience boggled my mind. I mean, I came back, I wrote a paper, even though I didn't have the data that I wanted. What I wound up doing was I wound up writing the paper entirely about what was going on in Barrytown. Now, this is in the spring of 1975. Phil Shaver wanted to publish it with me, and I'm not, without getting into the details, it never happened. The bottom line is that summer of 75, Phil left Columbia, went to NYU, and I had my own crap that I was engaged with. So we never wrote it, which is really a shame. It would have been the very first article. That would have been the very first article on cults and on quote unquote brainwashing in cults. So I missed my shot there, but oh well. But I did write this paper, and that paper got me. What happened was that paper then, when I was applying to graduate schools, I sent that paper out to the graduates. I thought it was kind of interesting, so I thought, well, let me send this to as an example of my work to the graduate programs I was applying to. And University of Pennsylvania, the chair. If you can just try to imagine this, I get an interview at the University of Pennsylvania, right, for grad school. And so I leave New York, I go to Philadelphia for the interview. The interviewer is the chair of the department at that time. His name was Art Dole. And Art had the best poker face of anyone I've ever known. You could not read this guy's face. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So he's talking to me, and we're chatting and everything. This is a group interview initially, and then it became individual after that. So we were chatting and all. And then he tells me, he says, so I read your paper on the Unification Church and on the Moonies. I said, okay. He said, oh, okay, great. And he said, yeah, I was really interested in it. And then I start talking about it. Oh yeah, the Moonies, they really strike me as being a controlling cult, and they're up to no good, and and at the time they were very supportive of Richard Nixon during Watergate, et cetera, et cetera. And then he just looks at me and with a completely straight face says, my daughter is a member of the Unification Church. At which point I thought, there goes my chances of getting to Penn. I insulted his daughter's church, right? No, on the contrary, he knew nothing about Unification Church, and my paper blew him away. And what he did was he arranged for me to get a full scholarship to go to Penn.
Oh, wow.
With the provision that I was going to devote my studies at Penn, eventually do my doctoral dissertation on a cult related topic, which I did. So so that's how I wound up at Penn, and that's how I wound up studying cults and being involved after I got my license and everything. Being involved in setting up a private group that worked with families and former cult members and things like that. And that group is Return, RETIRN, which is Reentry Therapy Information and Referral Network.
That's an incredible story.
Well, it's interesting.
It really is. It really is. You had like you said, in your DNA, you were so sensitive to coercion. And it was something that from your family history and probably some generational trauma there, and that they made you hyper aware of, right? And it turned into this lifelong career. But I wonder for other people how they might, I mean, you've given us some ideas here, but I'm just curious if you might give us some others of what is a cult and how might they know if they're in one, right? Because isn't part of it that you don't really realize you're in it until you're too far in it?
There was a time years ago, back in the 80s, around the mid to late 80s, I used to do a lot of TV talk shows. And back then, it was kind of funny because what they would do is they would bring on me and maybe an ex-member, and then they'd bring on two or three spokespeople from different cults, right? So you'd have like Scientology, Hare Krishna, and the Moonies.
Mm-hmm.
They don't do this anymore. They've gotten far more savvy over the past 40 years. But back then, it was hilarious because you'd have the Scientologists saying, we're not a cult, but the Moonies are. And the Moonies would say, no, we're not a cult, but Scientology is.
Yeah. Yeah.
We go back and forth like that. It was kind of funny. That doesn't happen anymore. They've gotten far more savvy. They've gotten far slicker and better, more knowledgeable, especially in the legal realm. Yeah. So one of the things that I started doing really probably 30 years ago is I began focusing, and a lot of people in the field do the same. I began focusing less on trying to identify which group is a cult,
Mm-hmm.
because they come and go, and
Yeah.
because there are thousands of them,
Mm-hmm.
and also because it's misleading, because people think that for you to be in a cultic situation, you've got to be in this big organization, like
Mm-hmm.
Scientology or Unification Church, the fundamentalist, the fundamentalist Latter-day Saints, the polygamous Mormons. That's unfortunate, or that was unfortunate, because it diverted people away from what really is going on and what's really important, and that is an awareness of what I call, and what other people call, cultic processes and cultic relationships. So, what am I talking about? Back in 1997, the Cultic Studies Journal had a really great special issue, and it's taken this long. It's taken well over 20 years for people to really pick up on this. It's happening now. But in 1997, there was a special issue on how domestic violence and domestic abuse is similar to cults.
When I was reading some of your work, your chapter that gets into brief intermittent developmental therapy, and
Right. Yeah.
hopefully we'll get into some of that. I was struck by how much I was reading that felt very similar to intimate partner violence and addiction.
Absolutely. Not only that, but in my doctoral dissertation, my doctoral dissertation was on deprogramming. To this day, as far as I know, I'm the only one who's ever actually sat through and quantified what happens in it was a 5-day deprogramming. And I noted that at that time that deprogrammers, and this is back in the 80s, we don't have deprogrammers anymore, but we have something different. But back in the 80s, I noted that, these ex-members would become deprogrammers. They were not mental health professionals. And it's an awful lot like AA, or like the early days of addictions counseling, where anyone working in a rehab had to be a recovered addict, and probably and maybe had some training in addictions, but that was it. In my state, my in Pennsylvania, where I lived for 25 years, up until I don't know, up until maybe the 1990s or so, to become certified as an addictions counselor, right? State certification as an addictions counselor in Pennsylvania at that time, all you needed was a high school diploma. That was it.
Wow.
As well as special training. I mean, you had to have, coursework in addictions and special training, but you did not even need a college degree. So the same thing that occurs. Yeah, I'm basically spinning off of what you said about how it's similar to addictions in certain ways. In certain ways, it is. Yeah, I totally agree.
Yeah. So maybe you can explain the processes and the relationships, and for signs for folks that maybe might think they might be in. And I also like this terminology, high demand, high demand group they might be in. How do they know, and also what makes someone vulnerable to that? Is it usually, do they target people who have previous trauma, or can anyone become a victim of this?
Okay, great questions, and difficult questions to answer in a few sentences. So bear with me.
Sure. Take your time.
First of all, yes, they, meaning different cult recruiters, and it depends on which group you're looking at, they absolutely target people who have had trauma. No question about it. In fact, many groups, there are psychotherapy cults that are designed, that have been, specifically designed for trauma survivors. We were involved in, we meaning my therapy group back in the 90s. We were involved in a class action, in a major lawsuits, 19 malpractice suits against one therapy group it was addictions, or it was a therapy, two therapists, licensed therapists, who had formed a practice based entirely on working with folks with addictions, and it was a cult. I mean, they had the first malpractice suit, which won the person who sued won millions of dollars. But I know her quite well, and I can tell you that to this day she would exchange every penny that she won in her lawsuit if she could have, 1 hour with one or two of her kids who are still estranged from her
Mm.
to this day, and they must be in their 30s or 40s, because what they told her that when she had children, that with her 1 year old, they said that she was addicted to her 1 year old, and they took the 1 year old away from her.
Wow.
So, horrendous kinds of things. So yeah, the cultic processes they exist in therapy groups. They exist in business groups. They exist in political groups. I mean, my friend Steve Hassan, of course, several years ago, and he was condemned for this by a lot of people, including people in the cult field. But he wrote a book called, The Cult of Trump. And now everyone agrees. I mean, but back in, 3 or 4, when the book came out, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, there were some people who said, "Oh, you're being too extreme. You're exaggerating, da da da, et cetera, et cetera." But no, now everyone, now you hear, national pundits talking about how Trump is a cult leader, basically.
Mm. Yeah, which like circles us back to how the connection between the political and our psychology as humans,
Yes.
they're
Yeah.
intimately connected. And when people are looking for someone to rescue them, to save them, when we're not looking inward, and of course, yeah, therapy, and therapists and psychotherapy has a history of this, right? When that client and therapist relationship is imbalanced, right? When we think outside of ourselves that someone can heal us or fix us, there's a big danger there.
That's right. Yes, there is danger there. Absolutely. So to get back to your question about vulnerability, what I will tell you are two things. Number one, the vast majority of people are vulnerable at some point, but there
Mhm.
are some people who are not. The people who are not vulnerable at any time, we usually refer to them as psychopaths or sociopaths.
Yeah.
The other group of people are severely psychotic people. So what are the two institutions that we have in our society that try to brainwash people to be good, right? Quote unquote good, prisons and mental hospitals. Neither of them work very well, do they?
Yeah.
Because you're dealing with people who are not very easily influenced.
Mm.
Sociopaths or criminals, they're not influenced by people.
So
That's
basically, you're saying, if you care and if you can empathize with others, I mean, it's a hard line, right?
that
Sometimes.
makes you vulnerable to influence.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, that's what makes life wonderful is that, I meet somebody new and I influence them and they influence me. And we leave that encounter, both of us leave a little bit changed.
Yeah.
And that's what makes life interesting and exciting. But when you're dealing with a cult member, the only person who gets changed is you. The cult member does not.
Oh,
So
I
it's,
love that. Okay. That's like
so
clear. Okay. I like that.
yeah. So the former executive director of the International Cultic Studies Association, ICSA, the former director, Michael Langone, years ago wrote this wonderful article about how cults engage in what he referred to as unethical communication. All right. Because when most people talk to each other, we all expect that we're going to influence. I'm going to be influenced and I'm going to influence. There's an expectation there that we're both going to be changed. But if you're a cult recruiter, you're acting as though I have an influence on you, but I'm not. So it's unethical. It's deceptive. So yeah, the two types of people who are not vulnerable to cults are, basically people with schizophrenia and sociopaths.
Yeah.
Now, that doesn't mean that the rest of us are always vulnerable to cults, not at all. But the rest of us will, at some point in our lives, go through a period in our lives when we are vulnerable to cults. Sometimes it's a period of transition. You're moving to a new place, you got a new job, you're married, or you got divorced, or you had kids, or you lost a kid, or whatever. But there's transition. Those periods are typically among the periods when we're most vulnerable. And of course, emotional trauma, loss, any kind of emotional dysregulation can also make people vulnerable to cultic influence. So why do some people become involved in cults and others don't? Well, Albert Bandura, a pretty well-known psychologist from back in the day, in 1982, he wrote a great article called The Psychology of Chance Encounters. And for me, it was a seminal article. I mean, for a lot of for other people, it may hit them as, oh, that's interesting. But for me, it really had deep, deep meaning. And the reason for that is because Bandura very clearly said at one point, I don't know if it was in an article, in a talk I heard him give or what, but at one point he said the difference between someone who gets into a cult versus someone who's not in a cult is luck.
Huh, yeah.
In other words, bad luck.
Yeah.
I'm going through a tough time. My wife is divorcing me. I've lost my job. I have to move to I've just moved to another city or another state. And I have the bad luck of running into a cult recruiter. If I don't run into the cult recruiter, I'll go through whatever I have to go through. And then eventually, hopefully I'll come out at the end of the tunnel. If I run into a cult leader, that's where I'm going to be more likely to be vulnerable to being recruited. So it's bad luck.
I always find recognizing and remembering how much luck plays into life to be sobering and helpful, especially for empathizing, right? It might be easy to think I would never end up in a cult, like,
Right.
like one of those guys or gals. But as you put it, so well there, it's when the circumstance, that you run into someone and you're in that vulnerable state, and maybe your detectors aren't as strong. Your BS detectors. You're susceptible.
Back years ago, 30, 40 years ago, there was also, most of the people who were being recruited in the cults tended to be white, young college students. And there was another thing in the play there, and that, and I would have, at that time, I was a white, young college student. So, a lot of us were brought up to believe that, sometimes people just give you things for free because they're just being nice.
Yeah.
Okay. So cult recruiting typically failed miserably among the lower class, folks, or among black folks, or among other minority folks, because they know that's bullshit.
Yeah.
They know you don't get nothing for free.
Right.
So
they smell that a mile away.
yeah. So when a Hare Krishna comes up to me back in the 70s and said, "Hey, would you like to come to this? It's a free dinner with lots of entertainment and lots of good people, and the food is awesome. It's vegetarian. It's really delicious." Blah blah blah. I'm like, "Yeah, sure, I'll do that." Whereas, my brother, my brother from the other side of town would say, "Whoa, wait a minute. What do you want in return? What's that?"
Yeah.
Oh, no, it's totally free. Bullshit. You want something. What is it? Okay, so you're absolutely right. Your radar is off at that time, and that can happen to anyone. Absolutely anyone. It gets really complicated, and then the ties become emotional. And when the ties become emotional, then a lot of times, just like with IPV, with intimate partner violence, when you're dealing with a couple that do in fact have a long history together, that do, maybe they have kids, or maybe they've got a business together, or they live together, or whatever, it's not, reason only goes so far. You need something more. You need something emotional. I would even say possibly spiritual. You need something non-rational, something beyond just good reasons to get out of the group.
So that's interesting. And I wanted to ask you about that. So, wait, I mean, yeah, you've taken us a lot into how someone would get caught up in this, what would happen. I mean, we didn't get into everything. We won't have enough time to, but
No.
I imagine there's a lot of isolation. You kind of started to get to it. Your time is full. You become removed from other people in your life, your family, your friends. So you become
Isolation is, you asked me, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but
No, it's
you
okay.
bring up a point that's really important and I missed earlier. Isolation is really important.
Yeah.
I would tell, one of my first bits of, you asked, well, how would you know that you're in a cult or in a cultic situation? I'm going to give you, there are two tests, if you will. Okay. One is, are you allowed to question what they say? And when I say question, I mean deeply. I don't mean just ask them. I mean do research. Are they going to say, hey, absolutely? Let's say we're talking about EMDR, right? And I'm assuming you know what EMDR is.
Yes.
It's a form of trauma treatment. And I'm certified in EMDR, but I got to tell you, some of the EMDR people, especially back in the beginning with Francis Shapiro, is a little on the culty side. So if I'm talking to somebody who's trained in EMDR and I bring up, and I ask them I want to write a paper on EMDR, can you give me some sources? are they going to just give me the sources that are pro EMDR, or are they going to give me the sources that are sort of critical as well?
Mm-hmm.
That's so if you're being recruited into anything, whether it's a business, a political organization, a religious organization, anything, you should ask them, where can I find information that might be a bit critical of your group or your beliefs or whatever? And is it okay if I look into that? Legitimate religions, for example, in my experience, will always say absolutely,
Yeah, that's
absolutely.
great.
You
Yeah.
want to try to get, you want to try to convert into Catholicism, that's fine, but you got to read the stuff that's, you got to read the Protestant literature, all right, or whatever. That's number one. Number two, absolutely avoid any group or process or any relationship that tells you to disassociate yourself from your family and friends
Yeah.
for any reason. And if they tell you to keep what we're doing secret.
Mm-hmm.
A
Yeah.
lot of motivation, a lot of self-help motivational groups like EST or LifeSpring, or they'll actually ask you to you won't be allowed to take their training unless you sign an NDA, right?
Well, yeah.
Where you don't disclose what they do in the group. Well, that's, to be blunt, once again, that is a big red flag.
Yeah.
Okay. There are thousands of studies of what the processes that are used in psychotherapy. Psychotherapy is a pretty transparent modality. And of course, as you know, there are many different kinds of modalities, and there are hundreds of studies in each one of those modalities.
Yeah. And you have part of it is letting people know
Right.
what they sign up for. So there's a whole process of explaining. There's a lot of psychoeducation when people enter of what they can expect, what they will and won't be asked to do as part of that relationship. And it is, I think it should be a give and take relationship. So it's quite different if it's done by
If it's
the
done
right
well
practitioner.
and done ethically,
And
yeah.
done ethically. And of course, we have lots of boards for that.
Hopefully, yeah, hopefully they're doing their job.
Yeah.
I was on the psychology board for 5 years. So I'd like to think we were doing our job, but at any rate, yeah. So does the group or the person, all right? Because this really, as I'm sure you know, with IPV, isolating the victim from her family and her friends is a core ingredient
Yeah.
to any domestic abuse. I mean, so isolating the person from their families, from their friends, from their other organizations that they may have been involved with,
Yeah.
et cetera, et cetera. In other words, what you're doing is you're breaking the person from the past. All right,
Yeah. And
you are
your past is also this line, it's your story and who you are. So I'm wondering, because I'm looking at the time, I'm wondering because I want to get to where people are when they come to you, right? Like severed from their past and their story, their identity, because that is deep trauma. And how do they, how do you help them build that up again? And I also, and I'm throwing a bunch of questions at you again, but you said something very interesting before about that reason won't always do it, and that sometimes there's a spirituality that someone kind of needs to find to help them. But what's interesting, a question I have is when someone has been traumatized by a quote unquote religious, type organization, they might feel scared about any spirituality.
a lot of folks do. Absolutely. So let me first of all, I need to draw a very clear distinction between two different kinds of people. And again, I'm generalizing here. So there are always outliers, and there are always, people that fit, even though they should be in one category, they fit more the other category, whatever. But basically in the field, we tend to distinguish between those who are adults who are recruited into a cultic group.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So you're 18, 19 years old, and you have the bad, and you've been dumped by your girlfriend or your boyfriend, and you've had the bad luck to running into a cult recruiter. And now 2 years later, you're out in the streets chanting Hare Krishna or whatever. That's one scenario. And you're absolutely right. I mean, I remember one of the first cult members or former cult members I ever worked with was a person who had left Scientology. They'd been in Scientology for about 20 years. So now they left Scientology, and they were at that time about maybe 38 years old or 39 years old. And what do you do? So they need, they want to look for a job. What do you put on your resume?
Yeah. Yeah.
I found, all you've done is been a cult recruiter for the last 20 years. What do you put on your resume? So that's one type. So those are what we refer to as, first generation cult members. But then there are the people who are born into the group, all right, which a lot of
Mm.
times we refer to as or multiple generation SGAs or MGAs, second generation adults. So these are people who all they knew, all they grew up with was the cultic group, and for various reasons they've left, and now you've got and I'm talking specifically about, or you've left or you've been removed.
Yeah.
I was involved in a class action lawsuit. It was 11 kids who'd been rescued from Tony Alamo's Christian missionaries. They were on a compound rather, and Tony Orlando died in prison. He was in prison for sex trafficking in young women.
Mm-hmm.
So he had multiple quote unquote wives, none of whom were old enough to have a high school diploma. So now you've got a 16-year-old girl, and I'm thinking of a specific person, 16-year-old girl who's rescued from the Tony Alamo group, right? And is now in public school, and she's never heard of Madonna.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
Okay. She has no idea what movies are. She's never seen, the only movies she's seen have been Bible-based movies. All right. So you talk to her about, E.T., and she's like, what? What's ET? The people who are born into these groups really struggle.
Yeah.
The degree of trauma that they've suffered and the degree of isolation that they have and the degree of trauma that they continue to suffer because of not being able to fit into society. And my colleagues and I, many, many years ago, coined a term that has also become somewhat popular, at least in the field. So I will take credit for this one. Can't take credit for love bombing, but I can take credit for the term cult hopping.
Cult
Um,
hopping.
yeah. As far as I know, I think Linda, Robbie, and I were the first ones to use that term back in around 83 or 84. But yeah, you wind up with people who may leave one group. They find out that, the cult leader is not who he says he was, and rarely are they. So what do I mean by that? I'm talking about like a small cultic church that we were involved with in South Jersey, where it finally came out that the pastor of that church, who was also the cult leader, is an independent Baptist church. The pastor of that church, was sleeping with half the congregation.
Yeah.
So when that came out, boom! Guess what? Overnight, the cult disappeared. But that's rare. I mean, that's pretty rare. But when second generation folks leave the groups, it's like, they don't have, well, let me back up for a minute. First generation. So let's say, you're 18, 19 years old, you get recruited into a cult, you're in the cult for 20 years, you leave, or you're talked into leaving or whatever. Okay. You at least have an older identity that you can go back to.
Yeah.
Right? You've got your pre-cult personality that you can, that never really left. What happens when adults are recruited into cults is they develop a pseudo identity. They develop kind of another layer, and their original identity kind of gets subsumed under that. So it's not the same thing as multiple personality disorder. Please don't misunderstand me there, or what is now, dissociative identity disorder. Not that. It's something different. It's closer to what Robert J. Lifton referred to as doubling. As he used that term to describe the doctors in concentration camps, how they could perform horrendous experiments and then go home and be good fathers and sons, and good fathers and husbands. So he referred to a process that he called it doubling. And that's as good a term as any. But we're talking about developing a pseudo identity on top of your identity, so that when that pseudo identity, when you begin to reject that pseudo identity because you've left the group, you have your old identity to kind of go back to.
Yeah.
Well, if you're born into the group, you don't have that.
Yeah.
You've got to develop basically an entirely new identity from scratch.
Yeah.
And it's hard because there are an awful lot of people who are more than happy to take advantage of you. They're more than happy to rip you off. They're more than, it's not unusual. And this gets really difficult because, well, Steve Hassan, although we've talked about this many, many years, over many, many years. Steve Hassan is the one who coined the term cult phobia. He referred to it as the induction of phobias. And that was brilliant. I have to give Stephen a lot of credit for that. What cults do is they create phobias. All right. So you were never afraid before. You were never afraid. I mean, guys touching you, like, hey, it's okay to touch my hand, but don't touch, certain areas are off limits, of course, et cetera, et cetera. You were never frightened of it, right?
Yeah. Okay.
But now you're a member of this Christian cult, and you believe, any form of sex outside of marriage in that cult. All right. Outside of that, any form of sex is satanic and demonic and evil. So now a guy, shakes your hand, and all of a sudden you're like, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, did I commit a sin? All right.
Yeah.
So they will cultic groups inculcate phobias that weren't there before. And of course, the biggest phobia is what's going to happen to you if you leave the group.
Right.
If you leave the group, you're going to die. You're going to get sick. Your family's going to suffer. In the Moonies, if you leave the Moonies, they have a belief that what you do affects your ancestry. All right. All the spirits in the past and all the spirits in the future. So that if I leave the Moonies, not only am I damning myself to hell, but I'm damning all my ancestors to hell. And I'm damning everyone who comes after me with my
Future
DNA to hell.
generations. Oh, very smart.
Yeah.
You have
So
to
it's
think about how you're going to keep people captive without chains. And this is how
That's
you
right.
do it.
And this is the big question I face in courts all the time because, people say like, well, no one's holding a gun to their head. And I said, that's right. But the goal of a cult, and again, I didn't invent this term. I don't remember who developed this term, but it's perfect. A term that's usually used in intelligence circles, but it works for cults. What a cult wants to do is they want you to become a deployable agent.
Mm-hmm.
And there's, the cult leader can't be with every cult member out there, right? So you got to get the cult leader in the cult member's head. And so they have to remain loyal to the cult even when they're away from the cult.
Yeah.
And they become essentially, in intelligence terms, they become deployable agents. So the induction of phobia is really important to keep a person in the group. And a lot of times when the SGAs leave cults, guess what? They wind up indulging in sex and drugs. They've never developed any mechanism for dealing. Let's talk about sex for one moment. And I admit, being my age, I'm a little I'm out of touch. The only information I get about sexual activity among young people today is from my patients. So, certainly when I was a kid, you made out, you fooled, you didn't jump right to intercourse, right?
Mm-hmm.
You fooled around, you made out, you had to learn how to control yourself, basically, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. That's part of growing up is learning how to control yourself sexually, how to control yourself romantically, how to control yourself in any social situation, how to behave appropriately in social situations. That's part of what we learn, especially in adolescence. Well, if you don't have an adolescence, okay,
Yeah.
now you're 22 years old. You don't know you have no experience with controlling your sexual impulses.
Yeah.
So you get turned on. You don't know what this is. What you know is that, oh my God, this is what they told me will send me to hell, but it feels really good. But you have no idea how to manage that. There's,
Right.
as one of my friends put it, there's no rudder. There's no way to control your impulses or your behaviors because you've had no experience with that.
Yeah.
How do you, when you're 23 years old and you find someone attractive and you want to have a date with them, how do you ask someone out on a date when you've never done that?
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So,
No, that makes so much sense.
so the trials and tribulations that SGAs or MGAs, so second generation adults, multiple generation adults, the trials that they go through are typically, not always, but typically really more difficult than the ones that adult recruits have had to go through. As much as traumatic as that may be.
Gosh. Yeah, they really have to learn what appropriate relationships are like
That's right. And boundaries.
and boundaries.
People in cults have, on Facebook, a friend of mine on Facebook who had been involved in Scientology, noted, he said, one of the things I realized is that people who leave cults have no ideas about boundaries.
No.
They don't know what personal boundaries are because they didn't have any. When you're in a cultic group, you have You don't have you're not supposed to have a private life.
Yeah.
Everything is up for confession. Everything should be known by the cult leader.
Mm. Yeah.
So there's no, you don't know how to you don't know how to negotiate boundaries usually.
So I imagine that the process of healing is, and even within the therapeutic relationship, is learning that. It's like the
Yes,
learning is all within relationship.
I think so. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't think it's something you can study. I think you have
Right.
to experience it.
Well, I think I really believe that, and a lot of Judith Herman's work is around that,
Hmm.
trauma happens because of relationship, right? Wrong relationship.
Hmm.
And it can really only be healed within relationship.
Human trauma. Yeah.
Yeah, human trauma.
I mean, no, we're not talking about tornadoes here. We're
Right,
talking
right. Yeah, more complex
mugging.
trauma, not what we sometimes think of as that single event.
Right. Little T versus big T is what they call it in EMDR.
So I'm wondering, as we're hitting our hour mark,
Yes.
if there is anything more you want to say about the healing process and about your therapeutic work. I know that could probably be a whole nother episode, but maybe you can share a little bit about the hope. We could end with a little bit of hope. Yeah.
Well, first of all, most people who leave cultic groups are amazingly resilient. They're amazingly resilient. I mean, to be blunt, you kind of have to be. I mean, just to survive in a cult, you've got to be pretty
Mm,
strong and pretty resilient. So
okay.
fortunately, when people leave cults, that resilience and that strength is typically with them.
And you're gonna be strength. I'm hearing like you're some strength based language, right? We're gonna, because if
Absolutely.
people are so, I'm not saying the right word, but I'm feeling like depleted, if they don't feel like they're anything or anyone, and I'm sure there's a lot of grief around the time that was lost, and building on and remind, that strength based work is going to be really helpful.
Yes. So the single best advice I can give to anyone who's been through any trauma, like really any trauma, all right, not just cult related trauma, but any trauma, stay away from, or at least be highly questioning of anyone or anything that offers quick solutions.
Yeah. Yeah.
If there's one soundbite that I can give, that would be it.
Yeah. It's going, if it took a process to get us into that state, then
It's going to take a process. You got it. It's going to take a process to get us out.
yeah. And trusting in that. Yeah.
Yeah, and unfortunately, especially with the SGAs, the born intos, those folks, in the trauma field, are you aware of the 3 generation rule?
That's what I thought of as far as like epigenetics.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yes, with severe trauma, we're talking about CC trauma, mostly complex chronic trauma. With CC trauma, with luck and good healing, it typically takes 3 generations for the trauma to undo itself.
Yeah.
So that's the other thing you got to let people know that you're doing this for yourself, but number one, you're not going to quote unquote be cured. All right, and number two, you're doing this more for your future generations.
Hmm.
You're doing this so that you don't pass it on.
I think that's beautiful, though. I mean, I think there's a lot of things that we would do for ourselves. Not everyone, but maybe speaking personally, but especially as a mom, right? There's
Hmm.
things that I could imagine or even gather the strength to do for someone, for my future generation, right? That I
That's
might not even be able to do for myself.
that's right.
And that kind of ties back into that could be the spirituality, right? That could be the vision that pulls someone, gives someone the power to believe in something.
I think so.
Well, that's beautiful. We started off talking about, the impacts of generations on you. We're ending with a
Yeah,
kind of call for future generations. I think that's a beautiful place to end. Is there
great.
anything that I didn't ask you that anything else that you want to share? And can you let people know how to find you if they want to learn more about you and your work?
Sure. Nothing else I want to share right now. The best way to find me is online. My website is drsteveichel.com. So it's DRSTEVEEICHEL, all one word, .com.
Great. And we'll link that in the show notes.
Great.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Pleasure talking with you.
As we buzz around the busy world, it becomes clear there are billions of paths. As we buzz around the busy world, we will appear in other people's photographs. As we speed through the centuries, we will collide and the light will bend. We will be accidentally immortalized in someone else's land.